Welcome to the Liberty Alert with Gregory Seltz, sponsored by our friends at the Lutheran Center for Religious Liberty here in Washington, D.C., a program that cuts through the chaos and confusion in the culture today by talking two kingdom citizenship, bold biblical principles for a robust public Christian life. And now your host, Dr. Gregory Seltz.
Good day, Washington, D.C., and friends of the program all around the country. I'm Gregory Seltz. Welcome to the Liberty Alert, where every week we try to cut through the noise and take on the issues, especially the public issues that matter to people of faith. We try to rely on the wisdom of the Word for the sake of the culture and the mission of the church. Or as we like to say at the LCRL, we're trying to put our temporal liberties to work for the sake of the eternal liberties of God for all. Today, we are privileged to speak with Joshua Hershberger. He is an attorney, a minister, a speaker, and you're heading up an initiative called the Daniel Initiative. Joshua, from the Indiana Family Institute. First of all, welcome to the program.
Great to be here. Thank you for the honor.
And tell me a little bit about this. I mean, I've met you already before. I met you at an event when I was speaking in Indiana. And you're kind of trying to do the same thing I'm doing, which is jump in as a Christian into this whole cultural, political milieu, but to have the heart of Christ and to want to be faithful to Christ and his church. And like we talked about just a little bit before, that's not that's easier said than done in some ways. But tell me about the Daniel Initiative and why you're involved in that.
Sure. And so I'll give kind of two quick responses, one on the kind of personal calling side. And then I think for your listeners that are interested in how Christians are engaging the public square, a little bit of the history of the movement. I think that might be interesting. So Right. Personally, from really as a teenager, kind of felt God calling me to a few things: preach the gospel, help defend religious freedom, try to renew the American experiment. Now, I knew I wouldn't be doing that alone. Like, oh, let's do that. We'll get that done tomorrow. Okay. But those were the kind of the big dreams that God put on my heart.
Those are big dreams. By the way, those are big dreams, my friend.
Yes. And so I was grateful for the opportunity to kind of jump into that space as a pastor, and then went on to law school, and then went into private practice, worked at a church, called into the public square. On the other side of this, a little bit of the history is listeners may be familiar with Focus on the Family and James Dobson. Dobson and Focus on the Family launched a group of ministries around the United States in the 80s and 90s, often called the kind of family policy councils. There are approximately 39 to 40 of them. I think the vision is to go to all 50. But these ministries would kind of traditionally done the heavy lifting at the state levels, which we also often call kind of the laboratories of democracy, of defending biblical principles, promoting that which is good, true, and beautiful. But over the just the span of time, and politics is a difficult business. You get pushed and pulled all sorts of different ways. I think at least some of those groups begin to rethink, how are we engaging government? And specifically in the state of Iowa, a colleague of mine named Greg Baker was sensing some of the same things that I was, and that the way I was doing ministry at the church, at my church, was different than the way I was doing ministry in the public square. So how could we kind of take some of the principles of just ministering to people, loving them? We are called to pray for our elected officials, but it's hard to do that if you don't know them. Right. So what if we took those principles to the State House? And so we launched the Daniel Initiative about 3 years ago. And the target on the wall for us is, how can we connect the ministers of God with the ministers of government in Romans 13? So the church is a God-ordained institution. The state's a God-ordained institution. If they're both doing their role properly, they should be partners rather than opponents. And that can be complicated. But we've been grateful over the last couple of years to have meetings with a number of our legislators, even some in the executive branch. Certainly, we share scripture with them. Mm-hmm. We ask, how can we partner with you? What are the worst problems in our state? How can we work with you? And then pray with them. And so it's just been great to see those relationships. We're nonpartisan. So across the aisle, we're having these meetings. And then the conversations we have about how we can impact our state. And so that's my Indiana-specific ministry. And then kind of around the country, I lead what's called the Good Citizen Project, which is primarily a writing, speaking ministry, and I provide some legal partnerships to help Christians be gospel-centered citizens. So kind of a long explanation, but in summary, it would be kind of rethinking Christian citizenship. How do we do this well now in a quickly polarizing, a plural society? How can we live out the gospel, exercise a citizenship that's worthy of the gospel now?
Yeah, and well, it's funny, that aligns a lot with what we do here at the Lutheran Center for Religious Liberty too. I mean, our work in some ways, I'm not a lawyer. I've been a pastor, an urban pastor all my life, and then radio guy. But when I came here, it was advocate and educate. Well, advocate what? Advocate fundamental things that we believe our society should be looking at: religious liberty, sanctity of life, marriage, and educational freedom are religious liberty issues to us. And educate, which is educate our people. And I think that's kind of like your good citizen project. But the last one, which you were talking about, is encourage. Encourage whom? Encourage the people who are on the Hill. So meet with them, get to know them. We're not here, we're not lobbyists. We're just there to say, here's who we are. Here's the things we think are important, but we're also here to support you, to pray for you. If you need to talk to somebody, to provide even pastoral care so that you can actually talk to somebody in confidence, that, and you're right, that kind of thing. We don't even think like that for a lot of our elected officials. And that's kind of a shame, isn't it?
It is. And it is interesting that passage about, we're commanded to pray for all men, including those that are in authority, of course, was written in the context of Emperor Nero, who killed Christians, his political opponents, and even his own mom. So I the church who does that? Okay.
Yeah. Well, okay. Now I want to get into some of the guts of your book too, because first of all, great book, The Good Citizen, and it's hard to write this book, folks. It's not as easy as you think, because Jesus himself, it's funny. Let's just start off with this phrase. People talk about the separation of church and state, which is a really interesting thing. What I do now with them, and I don't know what you think about this, Josh, I say, I didn't know you were a Christian. They say, wait a minute. I said separation of church and state. Yeah. I said, well, yeah, that's the biblical worldview on the relationship between church and state. Radical secularists don't believe the church should have any role in public. And of course, theocrats don't believe the state has any real meaningful role. The one that talks about Caesar having a role and the church having a role is the Christian worldview. So I always start off the discussion, do you believe? We don't call it the separation. We call it the differentiation of church and state. So I usually start with, I didn't know you were a Christian. Do you think that would fly today?
Probably not. And the more I've thought about Matthew 22:21, and I had on Andrew Walker, who recently wrote a book on religious freedom, just how profound that statement was for the political order of the day. And I think you see Martin Luther, speaking of the Lutherans, right? Kind of bringing that back to the medieval world's attention when he stands there and says, "Here I stand, I can do no other." And here's the Holy Roman Emperor with the power of the Pope saying, "What?
What is he doing?"
and Luther's just saying, "Well, this is Jesus's principle." So absolutely.
And the thing is too, when Jesus says he differentiates, it's not that Caesar was doing his own thing, because later on when Pontius Pilate says, "I can do whatever I want to you," John 18, he said, "Well, no, it's only what's given to you." So again, this whole idea of limited government, that it has a limited purpose, because government wasn't in the garden, government came later, but it's still God ordained. So there's a point where this idea of limited government, separate and let the free, religiously motivated, self-disciplining citizen do his own thing for the sake of the community. That was such a radical thing, because it honored both of those spheres. And that's what you were talking about when you talked about the principles of government in one of your chapters. I think one of the things you said was that government needs a focus. So they need to be told, here's what your job is. But we honor you as God's role in our life. Talk about those principles you said about good government.
Absolutely. And so kind of the big idea of the book was I've noticed kind of around the country, Christians take very differing views of their role to government or their interaction with government. On one hand, you have some Christians that are just, I'm not going to touch it with a 10-foot pole. Others, though they would not perhaps say this, they will even jeopardize biblical principles in pursuit of short-term political gain. And well, neither one of those I think is biblical. So the simple idea being, well, if the church does not disciple Christians on their role of citizen, just like the church is supposed to disciple Christians in their role as husband, father, mother, child, student, employee, employer, if we're not discipling people in the role of citizen, they will be discipled by someone. They will be discipled by something. Maybe that's the party, social media, the news media, and they're not going to act in a Christian manner when they engage in the public square. So the big idea of the book is, well, we're called to follow Jesus in every area of our life, including our role as citizen. So how do we do that well? And I wanted to set out like 4 what I might term Dave Ramsey-like steps for engaging as a gospel-centered citizen. So the steps spell good, as in we're to be a good citizen. And the first one is to kind of go over or review your role as a citizen. And there's a lot there. The Bible has a lot to say about our interaction with government. I'll give you just kind of 3 guiding principles I give to Christians. Again, there's much more to unpack, but I use the term gospel-centered citizen. Mm-hmm. And of course, a great question these days is, well, what do you mean by that? Right. So what I mean by that is a Christian that when they step into the public square, they do their best to manage 3 principles. They kind of hold these things in tension, and they are sometimes in tension. And that is that we, first and foremost, we are Christians. Our ultimate allegiance is to Christ and to his kingdom. And not to a political party, not to a candidate, but to Christ and his kingdom. We realize that there's a God-ordained church, state, family, but first and foremost, Christ has our allegiance. The second one is that we are Caesar. And we're talking about Matthew 22:21, where Jesus says, render unto Caesar what is Caesar. Well, in that passage, Caesar is the ultimate authority. And I think sometimes Christians make the mistake of applying biblical principles to the Roman Empire rather than to the American Republic.
Yeah, it turns that upside down. It turns the whole Caesar thing upside down.
Yeah, so when I say we are Caesar, well, who has ultimate authority in our system? It's we, the people of the United States. Right. And that does, we're citizen sovereigns. I joke with churches, that doesn't entitle you to don a bed sheet and demand that your family fan you with palm leaves and feed you with grapes. You know, you ask Julius Caesar about how that went for him. But it does mean if we have authority, then we also have responsibility.
Yeah.
And I believe as American Christians, we have a responsibility to engage because that's what Caesar requires of us. Caesar requires our principled participation. And then the final one there is that we are citizens. And we see this in Jeremiah 29, really throughout the New Testament in the command to do good, that when we step into the public square, we're not to just seek our own self-interest, but rather we are to seek the good of all people. And so, again, a gospel-centered citizen is someone I would say is managing these tensions. I'm a Christian first. My ultimate allegiance is to Christ and his kingdom. We are Caesar. I have authority, therefore responsibility, and I'm a citizen. I am to seek the good of all people.
Let me jump in right now because
go ahead.
I want to ask you a question on that because I said, well, yeah, we're gospel-centered. The only thing I have a little problem with that is that some people think then we're supposed to preach, that's our ultimate role in government work even. And I would say, no, we're gospel motivated, but it's really the law that's the main tool in government. It's the coercive power of the law at its most curbing. It's not changing our hearts. It's just making sure that the worst tendencies of humanity don't come out. So government's job is to be the backstop, God's backstop that said, you know what, we're not letting you be worse than this. And so that's why I think the founding fathers limited it, because obviously government can't solve problems if it's only the backstop. That was my struggle a little bit with whether government needs a focus or whether government needs to be limited and needs to be told what to do. And I think that's where a lot of Christians are struggling today. I don't know, what do you think about this? I think Christians a lot of people have way too high of expectations of what the government's supposed to do and way too low of expectations of what they're supposed to do in their families, their communities, and in their neighborhoods. What do you think?
Absolutely. And in fact, the passage of scripture I've been sharing with legislators this week was Titus 3 that talks about how we're to obey magistrates. Right. But then we're to be doing good to all men. And I point out to elected officials, and to your point of, I'm not even sure some of the Christians in our churches that run for public life have been given a robust public theology.
I agree.
And so 1 Peter 2, Romans 13 make very clear that government's role is to punish evil and to promote good. Now, because it's the Bible, like whose definition of good and evil is supposed to punish and promote? Well, God's. Okay,
right.
that's okay, pretty simple. All right. And then the church's role is to fulfill the Great Commission, to do good works that point people to Jesus. And so the state's role, like you said, is actually pretty limited. It's supposed to restrain evil, maintain order, and then it's supposed to promote good. And the other passage that strikes me as being an example of this is in Timothy, where we're commanded to pray for all that are in authority. Why? So that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life, so that all men may come unto a knowledge of the truth. There's the example. Government's it just kind of maintains the guardrails so that the church is free to preach the gospel, so that all men will come to a saving knowledge of Christ. That's the way it's supposed to work. And
well,
you mentioned, go ahead.
Yeah, we wrote we have these things called mom and pop papers, because one of the accusations against Lutherans is that whenever we answer a question, we usually give you 600 pages.
I appreciate that. Well thought out, right?
Yeah, we anticipate and someone said, please, just 500 words. And so we try to do these. So we try to come up with, like you said, a way of envisioning this engagement. One of them we wrote was called, it's a bit terrible when the referees play the game. Mm. And again, a lot of us are sports people. I love sports. You probably love sports and these kind of things. Well, the games you hate watching are when the refs take over and all they're doing is shooting free throws, or all they're doing is getting penalties, and they're scoring because the refs are making the determination of who's going to win. Well, that's our view of government. Government's supposed to come up with the laws that we're all supposed to play by. And of course, then the rest of us are, obviously this doesn't work if you're not a self-disciplined, religiously motivated citizen like you're talking about. But that was the American experiment. I love how you said, in America, you're Caesar, but that's what it means to be Caesar, free to do the right thing. But when the refs start playing the game, and there's a lot of us now who keep thinking, man, these government officials, they think they're going to solve every problem in life. And first of all, they mess it up because they can't. But secondly, what does it do to an electorate that stops living, that actually stops serving, that stops loving because it doesn't think that's their job anymore?
Kind of the same idea, trying to figure out how can I illustrate this for individuals and even kind of remember it for myself. And you mentioned earlier, I would say that government needs a guide. Martin Luther King Jr. talks about how the church is supposed to be the conscience of the state, not its master or its servant. And so I was just thinking, okay, so government's role is to punish evil, promote good. And in Scripture, the state is often symbolized by a sword. And then the church's role, fulfill the Great Commission, do good works that point people to Jesus. The church is often envisioned as a light. Well, if the state is coming over and basically co-opting the church's spiritual authority to say, basically, here's what's good, and you must do this. It's exactly backwards, right? And so I kind of joke with congregations. Well, what do you get when you put together a sword and a light? Well, you get a lightsaber.
There you go.
I actually have a lightsaber in the video behind me. People are like, "Why do you have a Star Wars?" I'm like, "Well, this is a reminder to me." And I think the specific. I'll just get specific here. Yeah. A specific iteration of this in American culture right now has to do with human sexuality. And the government coming in saying, here is our view of marriage. Here's our view of human sexuality. Church, you have it wrong, and you must conform to our beliefs. That's exactly backwards in a society. So
how do you as a church, see, this is where I think it gets tough. When we're just as broken and sinful in comparison to those commandments, the world says, who gives you the right to put that curb down? And I think that's where we're at in a libertine culture today that says there are no curbs. How do I say thou shalt not steal? Why can't the guy go into CVS and clean it out as long as it's under $99? They feel the weight of their own sin, but the answer is what, man? These commands are for us all.
And I tell you, I have wrestled with this a lot because I do want to care for people. I also know I'm not a perfect person. And don't ask my wife about that. She'll have specific examples, right? I've wrestled with this a lot. And of course, the way that I often hear it framed is, well, you're just legislating your own morality. And it's in this, like, your subjective, selfish morality, and you're foisting it upon people that are non-Christians. So where I've come back to is that the foundation of the church's public witness is the Imago Dei, the fact that we are all created in God's image. Right. And So many of those, the principles that we promote, things like the sanctity of life or the biblical sexual ethic, religious liberty for all people, they all are connected and strengthened by that fact. Right. And so what I've kind of landed on as a base at a foundational principle level, if you are promoting principles in public life based on the fact that we're all created in God's image or on God's law, you are not selfishly legislating your own morality. Right. Rather, you are promoting God's principles in an institution that He created. And we should absolutely do it we should absolutely do that with confidence, because we know it's not just good for me. Right. This is the way that God created the world, and it's good for everyone.
Well, I think you're right. I think you're onto something there that we've got to really struggle with, how to say why this is such a great thing, even though it curbs us too.
Kind of one last thought there. Yeah. I do think the foundational clash in our culture right now is the two differing views of freedom that you just identified. Yeah. And the American founders, the biblical view of freedom is an ordered liberty, that within God's good design, we flourish, we find freedom. And our society, of course, has this idea of open license. Like, I can do whatever I want, and that's true freedom. But what we find is that actually leads to bondage. It actually leads to death in kind of the biblical sense of not flourishing. So just kind of keep the outline moving a bit.
Yeah.
What I did was kind of lay out those biblical principles. Yeah. But then, because I think most American Christians, we often, like, maybe in the Lutheran church is different, but in a lot of evangelical churches that I'm in, they cut their historic memory, or at least kind of religious historic memory, goes back to about the 1970s. My point is that, Christians have been, practicing citizenship long before George Washington didn't chop down a cherry tree. I mean, it's like, right. So I went back and, okay, who are the characters in the Bible that interacted with government? Some of the key ones being Esther, Nehemiah, and Daniel, that were followers of Jehovah, in actually engaging in a more foreign or perhaps plural government. And I think secular. We should pay attention to that. Paul had civitas. How did he use it? How did Jesus interact? And then I went through kind of continents and ages, and this, for me, researching the book, was perhaps the most rich experience. Just looking back to those followers of Jesus who have stood up to tyrants, who helped end chattel slavery. And so how did they work through this? And so I won't go into a lot of those, but I've just enjoyed studying some new figures like Frumentius in the early church, right, all the way to learning more about Frederick Douglass and others. So
let me jump in here too, just to say, for those who, the book is called The Good Citizen, a 4-step guide to gospel-centered citizenship. And that was a great section of the book. Keep going. I appreciate that. And that I just drew a lot of strength from it. And so then when I speak in churches, I'm like, hey, I'm going to spend a lot of time on step number 1. So if I'm about 20 minutes into this and you're thinking, oh boy, I think the most important thing we can do is, what does God say? What are some of the examples of that? But then just like, if you're going to look at any area of your life, like, how could I be, for me, how could I be a good husband, or how can somebody be a good pastor? I mean, you're going to find some things that are pretty easy. Okay, here's let's check this box. And one of them for sure is the command to pray for our elected officials. Right. But it's hard to pray for someone you don't know who they are. So I encourage Christians to go to their state websites. Here in Indiana, it's Indiana Secretary of State. Who are my elected officials? And you literally type in your address, and it'll pull up all of your elected officials, and you can begin praying for them. And again, a key part of the Daniel Initiative here in Indiana, and similar efforts are launching other places, is, let's get the pastors actually in the building with the legislators, because the one thing I found that cuts through the ideological tension these days is relationship. Exactly. Because we stop talking past each other, we're looking each other in the face, and you may be a staunch progressive, this pastor may be a staunch conservative, but this pastor can say, I'm called to pray for you. You're a fellow image bearer. What is going on in your family? And it is just, I've watched it happen. It's just remarkable. And so that's, again, nobody probably looks at that and says, wow, I've never thought of that before. It takes time. It takes effort. But are we reaching out to those that may not agree with us? So, offer prayer for, build relationships with them.
And then my colleague from Iowa talks about moving at the speed of relationships. So as you're building that relationship with the elected official, you ask them, kind of moving on to step number 3, is to offer solutions for and partner with government to solve key problems. So I asked Governor Holcomb in the state of Indiana, what are some of the key issues in our state that the church can help without thinking? I mean, because he just thinks about them all the time. He racked off foster care, the drug crisis, recidivism, people coming out of jail and getting thrown right back in. We have identified how can the church in Indiana, and really, I'll sometimes say these issues are affecting Americans from the holler to the high rise. I mean, you could probably ask an elected official in Manhattan, what are some of the issues you're dealing with? And much of it comes back to the disintegration of the American nuclear family. Sure. So these are problems affecting us all. So the church is called to do good, and to the last point, which is to do the hard work of Christian citizenship. Because it would be great if you can step into the public square and start serving in these spaces, and everybody be your cheerleader. But the Fulton case is a perfect example. I mean, Catholic Charities have been involved in foster care long before the city of Philadelphia, and there wasn't even a complaint. And the city just comes in, I'm sorry, if you're not going to place with same-sex couples, you're done. You're not going to provide foster care. And so those that are in ministry and kind of jump into these spaces, you eventually run into government. And as government's power and reach expands, you just are going to run into it. And so doing the hard work of Christian citizenship are the things we might more traditionally identify with that role. So things like, the first one I might say is social media, that this is the first place that Christians step into the public square. My encouragement to Christians is to actually have an opinion, but then to share it in a Christ-like manner, right? Yeah. So not the 9 o'clock, hey, my church is having a great service, everyone's welcome, and then 9:02, you're calling somebody either a libtard or a right-wing Nazi, all right? And so it's like kind of, and back to the point of, as Christians, we're supposed to do all to the glory of God. And I think we've kind of split those off into different categories. But then that leads us to something like public policy. And public policy sounds scary to people that aren't engaged in public life. But it's truly, if we should engage in public policy as an expression of love for neighbor.
Well, Josh, thank you so much. The book is called The Good Citizen, a 4-step guide to gospel-centered citizenship. So if people really do want to find a way to be good citizens and at the same time understand how being a good citizen and being a person of Christ, they're not opposed to each other. To that end, thanks for being here with us today, Josh.
Thank you for the opportunity. I appreciate it.
Thanks for tuning in today. To get to know our LCRL DC work better, check out our website at lcrlfreedom.org. Contained there are resources to empower your public square dynamic discipleship. Or check out our weekly Word from the Center opinion piece every Friday at facebook.com/LCRL Freedom. Till next time, God bless you always. I'm Gregory Seltz. Have a great week.
You've been listening to Liberty Alert with Dr. Gregory Seltz, Executive Director of the Lutheran Center for Religious Liberty in Washington, D.C. This program has been brought to you by the Lutheran Center for Religious Liberty.